My name is Avery Thompson. I'm 33 years old. And by the time Thanksgiving dinner was over, my family finally understood that silence does not always mean weakness. I had barely set down my coat when I realized something was off in that house. The air felt too polished, too rehearsed, like everyone was waiting for a curtain to rise on a performance I had not been invited to. My father kept checking his phone with that smug little look he got whenever he thought he was about to impress a room. My mother smiled too brightly. My siblings were practically vibrating with excitement before the turkey even hit the table. And me, I just sat there watching because I had seen that look on my father's face before. It was the look he wore right before reminding me that in this family I was never the one who mattered. Dinner started like every other holiday meal in that house. Expensive china, forced laughter, and the kind of conversation that sounded warm until you listened closely. Then my father stood up with his wine glass, and that old familiar authority in his voice, and the room instantly quieted. He announced he was selling the family business, not passing it down, not keeping it in the family, selling it. Then he dropped the second bomb, and made it clear I was getting nothing. Not a title, not a share, not even the courtesy of pretending I had ever belonged in the future he had planned. Everyone reacted exactly the way you'd expect. Everyone except me. Because while they were busy celebrating and panicking, I only had one question left to ask. And when I asked it, the answer changed everything in that room. Before I tell you what he said next, and why that Thanksgiving ended in total silence, tell me what the weather is like, where you are right now, and where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. I grew up in Oak Brook, Illinois, in a house that looked like success from every angle. The front lawn was always trimmed so precisely, it barely looked real. The dining room was reserved for holidays and business guests, and every wall seemed to carry some reminder that the Thompson name mattered. My grandfather, Walter Thompson, had started the company in 1982 with a handful of warehouse clients and one clunky software program that helped trucking firms track shipments faster than the competition. My father took that small regional operation and turned it into Thompson Logistics Systems, a respected Midwest software company that served distributors, carriers, and supply chain firms who believed loyalty mattered more than innovation. In public, people called it a family legacy. In private, it was my father's kingdom, and everybody in that house knew exactly who he believed was meant to inherit it. It was not me. I was the middle child, the one who noticed patterns too quickly, asked too many questions, and actually cared how the technology worked beneath the polished sales pitch. By the time I was 12, I was teaching myself code online after finishing homework. By 16, I was building prototype dashboards for fun, just to see how data could predict delays before they happened. I thought that mattered. I thought being useful mattered, but in my father's world, usefulness had less value than image, and image had less value than tradition. My older brother, Derek, was tradition in a tailored suit. He had the right handshake, the right last name, and the right confidence to fill a room, even when he had absolutely nothing to say. He loved golf, liked being photographed with clients, and somehow always got praised for leadership while other people fixed the problems around him. My younger sister, Haley, had no interest in the company itself, but she loved everything that came with being attached to it. She built her whole identity around polished family wealth, expensive brunches, perfect holiday decor, and captions about legacy, class, and hard work that would have been hilarious if they were not so shameless. Then there was my mother, Elizabeth, who had perfected the art of smoothing conflict until it looked like good manners. She could sense tension the second it entered a room. But instead of confronting it, she poured wine, changed the subject, and acted like silence was the same thing as peace. That was the rhythm of our family. Derek was praised. Haley was indulged. My father was obeyed and I was tolerated. At dinner, if I mentioned product architecture, my father would smile the way men smile at children with finger paint and say something like, "Avery, sweetheart, let's leave the business talk to the people actually running the business." If I pointed out inefficiencies in their outdated systems, he would wave me off and say, "Clients did not pay for trends. They paid for trust." Trust in his mind meant keeping things exactly the same until it was too late to change. What made it worse was that I was not imagining any of this. I was not the bitter daughter rewriting history because I did not get enough attention. I had the grades, the internships, the technical background, and the work ethic to earn a real seat at that table. I studied computer science and operations at Northwestern, graduated with honors, and came home believing that maybe finally he would have to see me as more than an inconvenience with good ideas. I still remember how hopeful I was the first time I brought up the future of predictive logistics at dinner. I had spent weeks building a model that showed how machine learning could help mid-size carriers reduce missed windows, labor waste, and fuel inefficiencies. I thought he would at least ask questions. Instead, he cut into his steak, barely looked up, and said, "Avery, companies like ours do not gamble on theory." Then he turned to Derek and asked about some client golf outing, as if I had not spoken at all. That was when I started to understand the real problem. My father did not ignore me because I lacked value. He ignored me because my value threatened a story he had already decided to tell about who mattered in this family. The moment everything broke happened when I was 23. And it did not happen in some dramatic boardroom in Chicago. It happened during one of those polished family business retreats my father loved to organize every summer in Wisconsin Dells. He called them strategy weekends, but they were really pageants. Executives showed up in resort casual, clients came for steak dinners and river views, and my father got to play visionary patriarch while Derek nodded beside him like a crown prince in training. I had spent 2 months preparing for that trip. I built a full presentation around AI-based supply forecasting and route optimization. Not in abstract terms, but in a way Thomson Logistics Systems could realistically implement in phases. I had real data, projected margins, risk analysis, and a practical rollout plan. I knew their clients were starting to feel the strain of bottlenecks, labor gaps, and outdated warehouse communication. I knew the market was shifting faster than my father understood. More than anything, I knew this proposal could move the company years ahead of its competitors if he gave it a chance. On the second afternoon of the retreat, after a long lunch and a round of self-congratulatory speeches about company culture, my father finally allowed me 20 minutes to present. I stood in front of a room full of senior staff, 2 legacy clients, Derek, my mother, and a few outside advisors. My laptop was connected. My notes were ready. And for the first 3 minutes, people actually listened. I showed how predictive modeling could flag shipping disruptions early. I showed how warehouse staffing could be adjusted based on demand patterns, instead of guesswork. I showed how even small carriers were beginning to expect smarter systems, faster insights, better integrations. Then my father leaned back, crossed his arms, and stopped me mid-sentence. Not with a question, not with a concern, with a laugh. It was not loud, but it was enough. Enough to make everyone else stop looking at the screen and start looking at him. He said, "Avery, this is exactly the problem with people who live in spreadsheets. You think intelligence is the same thing as leadership." Then he turned to the room and added, "My daughter is brilliant. No doubt about that. But she still does not understand how the real world works. We do not hand over serious businesses to people chasing ideas that sound good in classrooms. We hand them over to people who know how to protect what already works." Then he put a hand on Derek's shoulder and said, "That is why the future of this company is staying right where it belongs." I felt the blood rush into my face so fast. I thought I might pass out. Nobody said a word. Nobody defended me. Derek looked embarrassed for maybe half a second before settling into the smug silence of a man being publicly chosen. My mother stared at her folded hands. One client gave me that tight little sympathetic smile people use when they are relieved the humiliation is happening to someone else. I stood there for another few seconds, still holding the clicker, still pretending there was any dignity left to salvage. Then I closed my laptop, thanked the room in a voice that barely sounded like mine, and walked out. I did not cry until I got to the parking lot. Even then, it only lasted a minute, not because it did not hurt, but because something colder took over, something cleaner. I sat in my car with the engine running, and realized that if I stayed, that moment would be my whole life. Every good idea would be filtered through Derek. Every accomplishment would be minimized. Every failure would be used as proof that my father had been right all along. So, I drove back to Illinois that night, packed 2 suitcases, sold what I could, and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle with $4,000 and a fury I had no words for yet. My father called it a phase. My mother called it distance. Derek called it me being dramatic. But none of them understood what I had decided in that parking lot. I was not leaving to heal. I was leaving to build something that would eventually make all of them regret how easy it had been to underestimate me. Seattle was the first place I had ever lived where nobody cared what family I came from. And that turned out to be exactly what I needed. The city was gray, wet, expensive, and completely uninterested in my last name. I rented a tiny studio in Ballard with uneven floors and a radiator that made sounds like it was dying in the wall. I worked freelance contracts by day, sometimes by night, too, taking on back-end development, warehouse dashboard builds, API cleanup, anything that paid enough to cover rent and keep me moving. I stopped talking about Thomson Logistics Systems almost immediately, not because I wanted to hide from it, but because I wanted to know whether I was actually capable without it. I used the professional name Alex Rivera when I started pitching work, partly because I did not want my family name floating around tech circles, and partly because I wanted every client, investor, and partner to respond to the quality of the product instead of the story attached to the founder. Those first 2 years were brutal in the least glamorous way possible. I was exhausted all the time, never had enough money, and learned more from broken systems and impossible deadlines than any class had ever taught me. But there was one thing those years gave me that I had never had at home: clarity. The smaller logistics firms I worked with all had variations of the same problem. Their systems were fragmented. Their warehouse data lagged behind real conditions. Their dispatch decisions were reactive instead of predictive. And nobody had built a clean, affordable intelligence layer that could connect legacy software to live operational decisions in a way real companies could actually use. That was the gap. That was the future. So while I was doing contract work to survive, I was quietly building my own platform at night. The first version was ugly, half held together by caffeine and stubbornness, but it worked. It could pull warehouse throughput, route data, order velocity, and labor inputs into one environment and flag disruptions before they turned into expensive chaos. It was not magic. It was not a fantasy. It was exactly the kind of practical system my father had once dismissed because it came from me. My first paying customer was a mid-sized regional distributor outside Tacoma. Then came a cold storage operator, then a carrier group that wanted better dock flow visibility. I kept everything lean. I reinvested instead of celebrating. I hired carefully. I chose people who were smarter than me in specific ways, and humble enough to solve ugly problems without chasing credit. By the time I turned 28, the product had evolved into something real enough to attract acquisition interest. That was when I formed Avengers Holdings, a parent company that could own not just one platform, but a growing ecosystem around logistics, intelligence, warehouse orchestration, and predictive operations. I did not build it like a founder desperate to get famous. I built it like someone who had already learned what happens when image becomes more important than competence. We stayed private. We kept interviews rare. When investors wanted the founder out front, I sent my COO unless there was a legal reason for me to appear. When conferences invited me to keynote, I declined more often than I accepted. People in the industry knew Alex Rivera was sharp, private, and hard to read. That worked for me. Over the next 7 years, Avengers acquired smaller tools that solved complements: a dock scheduling startup in Portland, a warehouse analytics firm in Denver, a labor forecasting platform in Austin. None of them made headlines outside the trade press, but together they made us powerful in exactly the corners of the market that old-school companies never noticed until it was too late. We became valuable not because we were flashy, but because we were useful in places where inefficiency cost millions. All that time, my family knew almost nothing. When my mother asked how work was, I said it was busy. When Haley asked if I was still doing some kind of computer thing, I let her think that. When Derek asked whether I had finally joined a real company, I smiled and changed the subject. My father barely asked at all. He had already filed me away as the daughter who moved west to prove a point, and never quite made it back. That assumption became one of my greatest advantages, because while they were treating me like background noise, I was studying Thomson Logistics Systems from the outside with a level of honesty nobody inside that company was willing to apply. I read filings, followed vendor shifts, tracked client losses, watched their outdated architecture become a liability, and saw the obvious truth my father was too proud to admit. The company was still respected, but it was no longer strong. It was surviving on reputation, long relationships, and the illusion that yesterday's methods would protect tomorrow's margins. About 18 months before that Thanksgiving, I realized the window had opened. Thomson Logistics Systems was vulnerable, and if the right buyer stepped in, it could still be rebuilt instead of stripped for parts. I gave my father one chance before I made my move. Through intermediaries, Avengers sent a quiet, strategic partnership proposal that would have modernized the company without humiliating him. He rejected it almost immediately. He thought he was dismissing another outsider who did not understand his business. What he was actually doing was closing the last soft door I had left open for him. After that, I stopped trying to spare his pride. By the time Thanksgiving came around, every moving piece was already in motion. The board had been softened by months of pressure. The valuation had been anchored. The lawyers were deep in the documents, and my father still had no idea who was really sitting behind the offer. I arrived in Oakbrook the day before the holiday with one suitcase, one carefully neutral expression, and absolutely no intention of giving anything away too early. I did not come dripping in logos or trying to look like a caricature of success. That would have been too obvious, too desperate. Instead, I wore the kind of quiet confidence money buys only after it has stopped needing applause. My coat was tailored, my watch understated, my bag expensive enough to be noticed only by people who actually understood what they were seeing. The driver who dropped me off was there because I no longer felt like squeezing myself into a rental line after flying home, not because I needed to make an entrance, but the entrance made itself anyway. My mother opened the door and paused just long enough to take in the details. She hugged me warmly, then leaned back and said, "You look different." I smiled and told her Seattle had been good to me. That was technically true. It had been brutal too, but brutal in the way that forges something useful. Inside, the house looked the same. The same polished wood, the same staged family photographs, the same carefully preserved version of a life that had always looked more stable than it felt. My father was in his study, of course. He was always in his study before a major announcement, like a man rehearsing his own importance. I found Derek in the living room with a drink in his hand before noon, talking loudly about expansion plans as if he were already running the company. He hugged me with one arm, gave me a once-over, and asked if I was finally doing better out there. Better than what? I almost asked. But there was no point. Haley floated in a few minutes later, with her phone already pointed at the room, capturing cozy family Thanksgiving prep for followers who thought inherited money looked effortless because nobody ever filmed the mess behind it. She air-kissed my cheek and asked me if I had a boyfriend yet, in that tone women use when they are pretending to be curious but are really taking inventory. I told her no. She told me that was probably for the best because ambitious men hated strong women unless they could brag about them. Then she laughed like she had said something clever. The only person who seemed remotely unsettled by my presence was my mother. She kept watching me the way people watch a painting they are suddenly afraid they misunderstood the first time. Late that afternoon, I passed my father's study and heard his voice through the door clipped and self-satisfied. He was on speaker with someone from the legal team confirming numbers, timelines, and a final call after Thanksgiving dinner. 53 million, he said, and in his voice I could hear the relief of a man who believed he had pulled off one last great act of control. I stood there for a moment, listening. He still thought this sale would end the story on his terms. He still thought he was choosing the ending. When he came out and saw me in the hall, he gave me that distracted half-smile powerful men give people they do not consider relevant to the real conversation. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "You probably wouldn't be interested in the details." I told him maybe he would be surprised. He barely heard me. That night at dinner prep, my mother fussed over seating and silverware. Haley practiced casual angles for the dining room centerpiece. Derek made a joke about how Dad was probably about to make him rich enough to retire by 45. Nobody noticed that I never laughed. Nobody noticed that I spent the entire evening studying their faces, like I was memorizing the last version of a family dynamic that was about to stop existing. The hardest part was not keeping the secret. It was sitting in that house, hearing the same patterns, watching the same dismissals, and realizing they had no idea how close they were to learning that every assumption they had ever made about me was wrong. By the time Thanksgiving dinner finally began, I was not nervous. I was finished waiting. The dining room looked exactly the way it always had on holidays, which made what happened there feel even sharper. The table was set with my mother's best china. Candles glowed softly, and every seat reflected the same family hierarchy we had followed for years. My father at the head, my mother opposite him. Derek close enough to catch every approving glance. Haley, where the light hit her best. Me far enough away to be included, but never central. Dinner began with the usual performance. Compliments about the food, thin jokes, conversations that sounded warm until you actually listened. Derek talked about growth and legacy like he had personally built either one. Haley talked about a new brand deal and kept checking her phone under the table. My mother drank too quickly. My father barely touched his food because he was too full of himself to be hungry. Then just after the plates were cleared and before dessert, he tapped his glass with his fork. The room quieted instantly. He stood with that same polished authority I had seen my whole life and announced that after months of confidential negotiations, he had agreed to sell Thompson Logistics Systems. Derek actually smiled before he finished the sentence. Haley gasped, sounding more excited than shocked. My mother's face tightened, but she kept that careful social smile in place. Then my father delivered the second blow. He said none of us should expect some easy inheritance from the sale. He and my mother would decide where the money went, and a large portion would be directed elsewhere. Derek's smile disappeared. Haley blurted out, "Wait, what do you mean elsewhere?" My father kept talking about responsibility and stewardship, still expecting to sound noble while cutting his own children out of the future. Derek pushed back from the table and demanded to know how he could spend years at the company and still get blindsided like this. Haley panicked about what this would do to the family image. My mother told everyone to lower their voices. Through all of it, I stayed quiet. I set down my fork and waited until the room remembered I existed. Then I asked one question. "Dad, who's the buyer?" He straightened, pleased to hold one fact that still made him feel powerful. "Avengers Holdings," he said. "Final number is 53 million. Serious people. They know what this company is worth." I nodded once, let the silence stretch, then said, "Dad, I am Avengers Holdings." Nobody moved. Derek gave a short laugh first, because men like him always think the worst possibility must be a joke. Haley stared at me like I had started speaking another language. My mother slowly lowered her wine glass. My father did not react at all for a full 2 seconds, which told me he had heard me perfectly. Then he said, "Don't be ridiculous." I took a slim card case from my bag and placed one card on the table. Alex Rivera, founder and CEO, Avengers Holdings. My father picked it up, and I watched the change move across his face in stages. Confusion. Resistance. Then the ugly realization that the buyer he had admired was the daughter he had spent years dismissing. Derek demanded to know what game I was playing. I told him it was not a game. Avengers had negotiated through counsel and acquisition teams for months. The deal was legal, signed, and final. My father said the founder of Avengers was Alex Rivera. I told him Alex Rivera was a professional name, and serious businesses used intermediaries every day. Haley kept whispering, "Oh my God," like she thought that could reverse the night. My father asked how long I had been planning this. I told him the better question was how long he had refused to see what was right in front of him. I reminded him of the partnership proposal Avengers had sent months earlier, the one he rejected because he assumed nobody outside his circle understood the company. I told him Thompson Logistics Systems was surviving on old relationships, outdated systems, and his refusal to evolve. He said I had no right to humiliate him in his own home on Thanksgiving. I told him he sold the company himself. He just never imagined the person capable of buying it could be me. Derek shot to his feet and accused me of planning all this to destroy him. I said no. I had planned it to save a company he was helping ruin. Then I mentioned the vendor kickbacks, the padded invoices, and the side deals he thought nobody had traced. He froze instantly. My mother looked from him to me in disbelief. My father demanded an explanation, so I gave him one. During diligence, Avengers found a pattern of inflated contracts routed through a preferred vendor Derek kept defending. The overages led back to an account connected to him. Derek called me a liar. I told him I had the documentation. That was when the room really changed. Haley started crying. My father looked older, smaller somehow, stripped of the certainty he had worn for years. Finally, he asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted what I had earned. I wanted the company modernized before it collapsed under leadership that confused inheritance with competence. I wanted the people doing the real work to have a future not tied to his ego. And I wanted him just once to understand that his greatest mistake had not been underestimating the market. It had been underestimating his own daughter. The room went still again. My father sat down slowly. Derek stayed standing, pale and furious. My mother stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Then my father said, "I never imagined you could do something like this." And I answered, "That was your first mistake." That Thanksgiving dinner did not end with forgiveness, and I am glad it did not. Real damage does not disappear because one truth finally comes out. When the table broke apart, Derek went straight into threats about lawyers and betrayal. Haley locked herself in the powder room and started deleting posts before the internet could connect too many dots. My mother stood frozen in the dining room, looking like a woman who had spent decades preserving appearances, only to watch truth tear straight through them. My father said very little. That was how I knew he understood exactly what had happened. He called me into his study the next morning, just after 7. He had not slept. The room smelled like coffee, paper, and the stale panic of a man searching for a way back to the past. He asked me whether the sale could be stopped. I told him no. The board had approved it. The signatures were executed and the legal structure was locked. He asked what would happen to the company name. I told him I was not erasing my grandfather's legacy, but I was ending the illusion that legacy alone could run a modern business. Thomson Logistics Systems would stay through transition, then evolve under Avengers infrastructure. He asked what would happen to him. I told him he would be offered a chairman emeritus role, public respect, private irrelevance, and a generous package if he handled the transition professionally. That answer hurt him more than anger would have. Then he asked about Derek. I showed him enough evidence to destroy any fantasy he still had about his chosen heir. Derek had been skimming through vendor inflation while hiding behind family trust. By noon, he stopped threatening me and started bargaining. He was given a choice: repay what he could, resign quietly, and stay out of the headlines, or force a deeper legal review that would finish what was left of his credibility. He resigned within the week. The real punishment was not losing his title. It was that everyone finally saw him clearly, not as an heir, just as a mediocre man who had been carried too long. Haley's fall looked different, but it was real. Enough of the family drama leaked out for Brands to get nervous. She lost partnerships. Her engagement dropped. And for the first time, charm did not protect her. At first, she blamed me. Then, to my surprise, she changed. She stopped performing the effortless heiress fantasy and started speaking honestly about embarrassment, dependence, and how little she actually knew about building something real. It was the first authentic thing I had ever seen her do. My mother was harder to read. A few months later, she came to Seattle and admitted what she should have said years earlier. She had always known I was the strongest mind in the room. Every time she stayed silent, she told herself she was keeping the family together. Now she understood that silence does not protect families, it protects the people already winning. That was the closest thing to an apology she had ever given me. And because it was honest, I took it. My father never became easy, but he did become quieter. In public, he accepted the transition with as much dignity as he could salvage. In private, he had to live with the fact that the daughter he dismissed had built something powerful without his name, his money, or his permission. He stayed with the company in title only. People listened to him out of respect, not obligation. He could advise, but he could not command. For a man who had confused authority with identity for decades, that was punishment enough. 6 months later, the company looked different, healthier, faster, less theatrical. We had cleaned out bad contracts, upgraded failing systems, retained the people worth keeping, and rebuilt client confidence with results instead of legacy speeches. I split my time between Seattle and Chicago, but when I walked through those offices now, nobody looked through me. Nobody asked whether I understood the real world. I had not just bought the company, I had broken the pattern that poisoned it, and that was the real victory. Because revenge that ends with humiliation is shallow. The better ending is when the person who was underestimated does not just expose the truth. She builds something better out of it. That is the lesson I carry from that night. Family loyalty means nothing when it is built on favoritism, silence, and entitlement. A legacy is not preserved by handing power to the loudest son in the room. It is preserved by giving responsibility to the person willing to earn it. And if there is any real education in what happened to us, it is this. Never confuse comfort with character. Never mistake being chosen for being capable. And never assume the quiet one at the table has no power, just because she has not used it yet. By the next Thanksgiving, the room was smaller, the meal was simpler, and nobody reached for a speech. My father asked for my opinion before dessert. My mother listened when I answered. Haley talked about work without pretending it was effortless. Derek did not come, which was probably best for everyone. and for the first time in my life, I sat at that table without feeling invisible. Not because they finally gave me permission to matter, but because I had already learned I never needed to.